So, the monster on the loose. So, what am I referring to? The monster is the fact that anything can go to anyone at any time. And now that requires discipline on what that thing will be. It requires discipline on what the time will be and who the people are. But there's really no mechanism for that discipline, and it is uncontrollable to a degree. And I'm not advocating control or anything like that, but I am saying that what it does serve is really a distraction more than anything else, which is a monster given what's at stake. So the way we think about this, okay, so anything can be had at any time. So that means we can create lots of things that people can access. And those things may not be useful, they may not be purposeful, but they generate revenue, right? So when your products are essentially designed to either generate advertising revenue or they're consumer products, you don't necessarily have, let's say, the best purpose in mind, right? So what we have is, a revolution that's gone on in computing. So to begin with, Moore's law, which Gordon Moore postulated in 1965, still holds. So we have these massive exponential increases in computing power, and that's enabled things almost beyond our imagination. And so we certainly have a consumer base where there's a lot of products guided toward that consumer base. But then there's all this massive data, there's all this information, and so what we hoped for was that we'd have all this information and capability and all this computing power. So now we'll have artificial intelligence with a benevolent purpose. We'll have self-driving cars. We'll have, a more utopian-like society that technology will serve. Well, that's not what's really happening, right? So we're finding many challenges and many issues. And then there's regulation on top of that, which is then putting some friction into that whole system because we think, well, government needs to step in and needs to determine what should be developed, when, how it should work. But more importantly, thinking about, well, now wait a minute. There's a handful of people that are benefiting greatly. And is society really benefiting greatly from that? And are those benefits shared more equally? Well, they're not. And, they never will be. And government wants to intervene to enable that. Well, that, as I'm describing here, is a worse alternative. And well, does anyone really care about the metaverse? Well, there's an argument about that. I am on one side of that argument, but that's really not the point. The point is that this massive computing power, this massive capability, all this intelligence, and all of that can essentially create something that people can kind of go, well, kind of who cares, right? So the one thing that innovation has done is it created tremendous wealth, right? But that wealth has been concentrated, right? So in essence, all the money in the world has gone to 5 or 6 different companies, right? So when you look at Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, these companies, they've created tremendous innovation, they've created tremendous wealth, but it's been very concentrated. And people have a problem with that. Now, the issue, of course, is that's what happens. All business, all endeavors, it is more or less winner take all. I mean, look at sports, right? The best players make most of the money. Look at entertainment. The best entertainers make most of the money. It's the way the world works. And applied to business, it is a winner take all. And so we don't want the rewards to be regulated, distributed. One of the things that their sort of legislation is talking about is, well, let's just make all these developments available to the public immediately. Let's think of these technology companies as utilities, and let's just share all of their information and their data, and let's make them accessible and highly regulated. And of course, this would be disastrous, right? Because it is a world where these companies collectively are investing more than $100 billion a year in research and development. Where is that capital going to come from? Where are those innovations going to come from? And yes, there's an upward spiral with an innovative company that gets capital, that innovates further, that gets more capital as a result of that innovation, and the spiral continues. But the alternative to that is worse, right? So what I'm saying is, we really are creating a fragmented world, right? Now, in my experience in technology over the years, we started off in a very integrated world. And people worked together, borders didn't matter, nationalities didn't matter, nothing really mattered except the ability to think and create, right? So thinking and creating, whether you were in China, whether you were in Eastern Europe or in the United States, it didn't matter, right? You were working together. Well, that's become much more fragmented now. Now legislation is stepping in and they're trying to say, well, let's recreate pockets of Silicon Valley globally, and maybe even within the United States. Let's have these different pockets. And certainly within places like New York City, Boston, Los Angeles, there's an innovative environment. But Silicon Valley is unique, and it's not the physical location. It's not anything that can be recreated easily, because there's an intellectual ecosystem. There's a way to think. There's this innovation that you can test and retest among peers and people that have no economic stake other than to simply help you. And that Silicon Valley ethos is not something that can be recreated. It certainly can't be legislated, right? So we talk about the Silicon Valley state of mind, which is a cooperative ecosystem of thinking and testing and trying, and even some of the best ideas, you have the ability to go to informed people and say, what's wrong with this? What am I not thinking of? How can I make this a better venture, right? That is unique to create anywhere, and it does exist in a few places. Silicon Valley is one of them, but I'm really using Silicon Valley not as the only example, but it's rare. And unfortunately, as we become more fragmented, it becomes more and more rare. And I say, before we used to cooperate with entrepreneurs and companies in China. We used to think about a global market. Apple is an example of how that company evolved to be cooperative within China. Well, now we see that the Chinese, they're trying to keep their creativity within China. We're trying to keep our creativity within the United States. And anytime you limit creativity, you're making a fundamental mistake, right? So what I'm saying is we have a monster, and that monster is this global ability to create a technology. That monster can be a benevolent and good monster because it can address very difficult problems that we have globally, but we're becoming more fragmented. So we're really not addressing those problems because we're being more fragmented. So we end up with commercial models that really don't do a lot in terms of creating value for society in general. They may generate revenue for a particular company, but we have this regulation, we have the use of data and the application of data and the limitations of that, and it is stifling innovation, it's stifling creativity, and we have great computing power, but it's concentrated, and that's unpalatable to many people. So we have all these resources. Those resources can be applied, but now government wants to figure out how best to apply that. And in Ayn Rand's worst nightmare, it's when government steps in and says, well, there's too much money being made, let's figure out how to allocate it more appropriately. That's disastrous. So that's the real monster. The real monster is value has been created on an unprecedented scale, and there are people that just don't like that, who have the power to regulate and legislate, and that monster is really the true disaster that could happen. So it's the Silicon Valley state of mind that matters. It's be innovative, be cooperative, have an ecosystem of thought, an ecosystem of sharing, enable ruthless competition, enable people to create the best and the brightest products that solve real problems. If a company solves a big problem, there are great rewards for that problem, for that solution rather, to that problem. And that's what we should be encouraging. And that's only encouraged, I say, in this sort of Silicon Valley state of mind, which is we're looking for the best and brightest solutions. We don't care about anything other than doing our best job in a highly competitive environment. But that environment is also cooperative and thoughtful.